Before getting started, today's video is presented by NetApp, the cloud storage specialists. The Overwatch 1 Pro era has come to an end. Before saying hello to the next chapter, let's do some reflection, shall we? In particular, I think a discussion of the best teams ever is in order. There's been a handful of dominant franchises who could be considered the best team of the Overwatch 1 era. Among them is, of course, the San Francisco Shock. After the dominance they showcased the last few years, they're one of the first names that comes to mind for most people. Many fans argue they're the straight-up most dominant team of this era without question. And if we're being honest with ourselves, they make a great argument due to the criteria they meet. Let's prove why this is the case, shall we? Here are 5 reasons why the San Francisco Shock were the most dominant team in Overwatch 1 history. Number 1. Championships. Few in history have won as many major tournaments as the San Francisco Shock. At the conclusion of the 2021 season, the San Francisco Shock ended with a 2019 Stage 2 title, a 2019 Grand Finals Championship, a 2020 May Melee and Countdown Cup title, and a 2020 Grand Finals Championship. They won 5 out of 8 possible tournaments from 2019 through 2020, which is basically unheard of at this high of a level. While dominant contenders teams like British Hurricane have gone on similar streaks of dominance, most fans argue it is too limited to one region for it to be as significant as what the Shock were pulling off. When it comes to top-level play, you usually tend to think of the Overwatch League plus events that happened before, such as Apex, and in that regard, very few compare. One that likely comes to mind for most of the historians out there is Lunatic High. They too netted some impressive dominance behind legends of the game like Ryu Jae Hong, Toby, and Miro. Winning back-to-back Apex titles in 3 months of time deserves praise. However, their dominance only lasted for a year, while the Shock basically doubled that same level of production over 2 years. An argument could also be made for the Shanghai Dragons, I suppose, who also brought home a Grand Finals trophy and many regular season tournament victories in 3 years. In 2021, the Shanghai Dragons were truly better than the rest of the competition. The Shock have that extra Grand Finals trophy going for them, however, which is why I firmly believe the Shock sit on top of the throne when it comes to championships. Reason number 2. Win rate. The Shock are the only franchise with over 90 combined wins across all regular season, tournament, and playoff matches at the Overwatch League level. Their win-loss percentage translates to around 70%. And just remember that around half of those losses came in Season 1 before this team was, where they are today. They were still developing. Some other historically great teams like the NYXL have a similar overall win rate, so in this regard, the Shock do have some close competition, making this category seem like a wash to some of you. For total win-loss ratio, that's fine, I get it, but where this franchise blows everybody else out of the water is playoff records. Winning the major games are one of the biggest factors in deciding greatness in the field of sports, and the Shock have that covered. In 4 seasons, this team has won 13 playoff games with only 3 losses. That's a win percentage of over 80%, and not even dominant franchises like the Dragons reach this kind of number. The same applies to contenders teams like American Tornado or British Hurricane, as well as any other team who has played anywhere near the amount the Shock have. And here's the kicker. Their playoff map record is out of this world good. They just don't stop. For years on end, the Shock have always found ways to pull it off both in the regular season and in playoff scenarios. They were a top team in the league for 3 consecutive years, and their record proves it. Number 3. Flexibility. Given the balance patches and meta changes over the years, it goes without saying that the Shock have proven themselves in this regard to the maximum. We've especially seen a lot of variance in what's been played in 2020 and 2021 thanks to hero pools, but through all of it, the Shock have remained consistent. All players and coaches during their era of dominance have always had a great read on what's been going on. Even in supposed metas they were weaker in, this team usually found ways to surpass their limits. It goes all the way back to the GOATS era if we're being honest with each other. The Shock had their ups and downs at the start of Stage 1 2019, but as the Stage 1 tournament rolled around, they adjusted and their synergy greatly improved. And this was one of many comps where the Shock started to dominate everybody. In the 2019 playoffs, they quickly became the top double shield rush team. In 2020, they were easily a top rush and dive team in and they show no problems on double shield comps involving Baptiste and Zenyatta. Or what about the 2020 playoffs? Whether it was the Winston Rush or the Roadhog compositions during the Final Four, the San Francisco Shock rarely got pushed to their limits. Oftentimes, they were untouchable on certain meta compositions. This includes regular season tournaments and playoff scenarios, aka the most important metas to have a grasp on. Based on history, it is incredibly rare to stay on top through so many different iterations of the game, and unlike some teams who were dominant prior to 2020, the Shock were staying on top even through hero pools. You know how many games the Shock lost with hero pools in effect? 4. 4 times in 2 years. That is absurd, and not even the Dragons have lost that little in this scenario over that amount of time. The Shock sit alone in this regard, and despite the stress and adjustments that usually come with this kind of system, this team has always persevered. Nothing has stopped them from maintaining their status as a top team. Some of the other all-time greats never had to deal with these types of constant adjustments. As great as your Lunatic Highs and Runaways of the World were, there was a lot more consistency during that era. They were never challenged quite like how the modern teams have, hence why the Shock's flexibility is arguably more impressive. Reason number 4. Longevity. Obviously, this goes a long way in deciding if your team is a dynasty or not, and the Shock definitely have this down. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a dynasty is described as a sports franchise which has a prolonged run of successful seasons. As mentioned earlier, San Francisco have done nothing but win since 2019. The inaugural season was the only real year where they weren't competing. In their 3 years of relevance from 2019 up until the present day, they have won about 80% of their matches, which is absolutely ridiculous. To go out there, on average, and win 4 out of your 5 matches across a 3-year span is unlike anything we have ever seen at the pro Overwatch level. Nobody else has a percentage that reaches the 80% mark across multiple years. The 2020-2021 Shanghai Dragons reached the high 70s, which is no doubt impressive, but the Shock do hold a higher number over a longer period of time at the Overwatch League level. But some might argue that the Lunatic High dynasty at their peak was better, and mathematically, you technically would not be wrong. Lunatic High posted a combined 14-2 record when they won back-to-back Apex titles, and it's totally fair to say they were more dominant during their peak because of this. But one counter-argument you have to think about is the time period. Yes, Apex had world-class talent, there's no doubt about it, but only 3 months separated both of these events. That means that their peak and their longevity just doesn't even compare to the magnitude of the Shocks. The same applies for a team like Runaway or any other dominant contenders roster. Your British Hurricanes and American Tornadoes of the world will go down in history for what they accomplished, for sure. Sweeping their respective regions for a year's worth of time is absolutely not talked about enough. It's important to respect their accomplishments and the history they pulled off, but the number of years just aren't there to put them at the level of the Shock, which is why the Shock take a close victory in this category. And finally, we have number 5. Pulling off perfection. If there's one thing the Shock are better at than everybody else, it's pulling off acts of perfection. Does the Golden Stage ring a bell? This bit of history may never be replicated ever again at the highest level of play. For those who need a quick refresher, in Stage 2 of 2019, the Shock won 7 matches with 0 losses plus a 28-0 map record. Now, of course, this alone does not make the Shock exclusive. Other teams have pulled off similar feats. British Hurricane actually did this in 2020 European Contenders 3 separate times. That team was no joke, but the reason the Shock go ahead of them in this regard is due to the sheer number of games and maps. While it's not their fault due to the formatting, the Hurricane never played more than 13 maps in one of those instances, and some of those sets they were playing were only 2 maps long. The Shock always had to play 4 maps against 7 different opponents during a 5-week span. That's some incredible stamina and one heck of a drive. Adding on to that, the Shock just have an overwhelming number of undefeated qualifiers and stages. They netted a total of, I believe, 6 undefeated stages / qualifiers in 3 years. There's the 2 7-0 stages from 2019, the 3 undefeated tournament qualifiers in 2020, and the 4-0 June Joust qualifier in 2021. There have been other teams to go undefeated in tournaments and/or qualifiers. British Hurricane, Team CC, American Tornado, Runaway, Kangdu Panthera, the NYXL, the Vancouver Titans, and the Shanghai Dragons, and the list just keeps going on and on. No team has done more than the Shock though, that's the thing, and that ultimately makes them stand tall over all of the competition and is yet another argument why they're the best team to ever do it. Whether you love or hate them, one cannot deny the impact of the San Francisco Shock on the pro Overwatch scene the last 3 years. They're one of the best to ever do it, if not the best here in the present. Even if someone new goes on a run of their own in the distant future, it's going to be incredibly difficult to replicate and or outdo what the Shock of the Overwatch 1 era were able to accomplish. And that, my friends, are 5 reasons why the San Francisco Shock were the best team in Overwatch 1. Do you also believe the Shock were the best team of Overwatch 1? Tell us why down in the comments below. And if you don't, let us know who else you think it could be. Big shout out to the cloud storage specialists, NetApp, for partnering with us on today's video. And big time shout out goes to the Shock for letting me come on for a video today. I had a blast working with them, and it was a real dream come true for me. But that basically does it for me, Shock fans. I appreciate your hospitality a lot. And until next time, this is ATP and the San Francisco Shock, signing out. Peace.